All right, and I am here with Sir Ken Robinson. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well.
Good.
Thank you, Tim.
Good.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Now, people everywhere have seen your TED Talk, they've read your books, they're very familiar with all your ideas. But I want to ask a little bit about you personally. Can you tell a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where the love for the arts was established, and I guess kind of what inspired you to get into education and specifically arts education?
Well, thank you. I was born in Liverpool in England. I won't take you through the whole sordid business, but it was. But I was born there. I'm one of a large family. There are 7 kids. I have 5 brothers and a sister. I often wonder what that was like for her.
Yeah.
And I got interested in the things that I'd been doing, as people do, kind of unpredictably. When I was at school, I had no idea what I was going to do. Absolutely none. And I had some interests at school. I got involved in putting some plays on when I was in what's the equivalent in the UK of the junior year. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we call it the sixth form there. My particular, in the UK then, I think it's still actually largely true, when you get to be 16, you take school exams in a whole range of different disciplines. And then you get to choose 3, maybe 4, that you really want to study in a bit more depth for the next couple of years. They used to be called A-levels. There are different versions of them now. But so I chose to do English, Latin, and French. And we all did something called general studies, which was loosely liberal arts stroke politics. They were the areas that interested me most. And because of my interest in English, we'd also read a lot of plays at school. But we hadn't put any plays on. And I and a group of people, friends at school, thought we should. It would just be interesting and enjoyable to produce some plays. So we asked one of our teachers if he would direct the play. If I remember correctly, I think he was a geography teacher, but we just rather liked him. And he had an interest in drama. So he did. He directed a play that we were all in. We did all the heavy lifting. It was an after-school thing. We printed the tickets, sold the tickets, made the brochures, sold the brochures, went door to door, getting an audience organised. It was very interesting, and we liked it so much that we did another one. And that one was, I think, it was called She Stoops to Conquer by Goldsmith. And then we decided to do another one. Well, he was very indulgent, but at that point he gave up and he said, I can't really direct the next one, but I'd be happy to cast it.
Yeah.
So we all sat round in a circle, but by then we'd enlisted some girls from the girls' school, like actual girls.
Right.
Because we didn't really want to be doing the female parts in drag, particularly. Yeah. It was an Oscar Wilde play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And he sat round the circle, and we all did, and he handed out the parts. And I was hoping for a decent part in the play. Mm-hmm. I'd been in a couple of them before. Acting's not my thing, truthfully. I don't particularly didn't want a lead part, but I'd had a part in the other ones. And I think stage managed the first one. And he got through all the parts, and I didn't get one. I thought, oh, there we go. Well, so probably I'm stage managing again.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't have time to direct the play this year, but I have a suggestion. I think Ken should do it. Well, I nearly fell through a hole in the floor. I thought, that can't be true. I mean, I can't direct a play. That's ridiculous. And I confidently expected everybody else in the room to agree and say, are you serious?
Yeah.
But they didn't. They all nodded and said, yeah, that'd be great. So I thought, well, if they think I can do it, then I'm not going to back off it. So I did. And I really enjoyed doing it. And it was a great success in our terms. And it was partly because of that I went to college to do English and drama. And at college I got interested. It was a wonderful place called Bretton Hall in Yorkshire. And it was because of that I got interested in the place of drama in schools. I thought, well, this was such a good experience. Why isn't there more of it in schools? Mm-hmm. Why do we spend so much time reading plays in English lessons but very little performing them? It's a bit like spending your time in music lessons reading music scores but never picking up an instrument, it seemed. So anyway, over that period, I became interested in that, and through that, interested in the whole idea of a more holistic approach to education. And I qualified as a teacher of English and theatre, but I wanted to do some research of my own, before settling down. There were all kinds of unanswered questions I had, and so I got onto a research path quite quickly, and I became involved in a national research project, and then the more interest I got in drama, the more also I was interested in talking to other people who worked in the arts. I talked to a lot of art teachers. I hung out with musicians. I was living in London by then, and I went to a lot of cultural and community arts programs. There was a lot of very interesting stuff happening in London at the time. There was a big arts lab movement, and there were people who were using theatre in fairly radical ways in the community and in schools. So but none of that was a plan. It wasn't that I was thinking that back then, if it all worked out well, I'd be hanging out with you doing this podcast.
Right.
It wasn't like that. It was just the thing that was interesting next to me. And I found, as I got interested and got to talk to people more, my interest in it deepened, and I was living another life as well as all this. That's it. I had friends, and I was trying to earn a living and hold, body and soul together like you do when you're in your 20s. And just over time, I was asked to run courses about the things I was finding out about. And the first job I got was for a proper job, was for a national research project on drama, which coincided with my interests and was being run at the same university where I was doing my degree. And so I had a paid job for a couple of years, and then it was extended for a year, and we were required to run courses as part of the contract. And I had to go and talk about it, and we wrote a book. I had to go and talk about the book, and it never crossed my mind to give talks to anybody about anything. It's not my natural mode. It's not like I wake up in the morning, who can I give a talk to now? And on the contrary, I'm actually rather withdrawn often, very socially. It's not, I don't go looking for it, but I found I could do it, and I rather enjoyed it when I did, and running the courses was interesting and it was very fulfilling. So it went like that, and then I got involved in art programs, and in due course, you build it turns out you look backwards and realise it adds up to some sort of career.
Yeah.
But it's been driven by a couple of interests. One of them is a deep interest in talent and creativity and the nature of it and how people make their lives on the one hand, and I've always felt that a lot of people have not discovered those things in education, or where they have, they've often felt that they didn't matter. Mm-hmm. And that's not the fault of teachers or school principals. I'm not pointing a finger at anybody. It's the way the system works. And it's a system. It's as well to know that. It's a system with its own features and characteristics, and it doesn't prioritize these things. And that was the second thing, why not? And I know there are a lot of people in education who think these things are important too. A lot of them work in the arts, not all of them, but many of them. And so as well as being an interest, it also became the focus of research and advocacy and campaigning, because I think it really matters, and I've tried to advance the case for it mattering and to show how these can be better provided for. So suddenly you look back and it's 40 years and you think, what happened? I should have started running restaurants and at least I'd have eaten regularly.
Now, and as part of your career, I know you moved here to Los Angeles in, I think, 2001, you said, and you're working as an education advisor at the Getty. And I guess my big question for you is, what made you want to leave the UK and come to the United States? And then I guess as a consequence of that, what kind of differences have you seen, living here in the United States, whether those are, educational or cultural or whatever? I was like, what has been the biggest change for you living here?
Well, I moved out here in 2001. I'd had some connection with the Getty Center in Los Angeles in the 90s when I was a professor at Warwick University, because the Getty at the time had a very big program in visual art education. It was called discipline-based art education, and it applied to other fields as well, but the Getty, being a visual arts organisation, had a particular focus on visual arts. And because I was involved in arts education, I was professor of arts education at Warwick University and ran a large department there. I, of course, was aware of the work that the Getty did, and some of the people there were aware of what I was doing, and I was invited in the mid-90s to speak at their annual conference, the Art Education Institute, in Washington, which I did. And then subsequently, I was asked if I would be interested to spend some time at the old Institute for Art Education at the Getty, which I did. And I also did a tour of some of the regional institutes they were supporting. I spent about 6 weeks in America. And then in 2000, I was asked to go to the Getty to speak at a conference of philanthropists who were involved in education. And by then, the Getty had a new president, and they had an internal review, and they closed down the whole art education program, the separate institute. And that had caused a real tremor in the art education world in America, because the Getty, as they often said, was the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And they not only supported DBA intellectually, they funded a lot of DBA work. And people were very anxious and concerned about what that meant that they'd pulled out. Well, I got to meet the president at the time, and I was invited back after this conference in 2000 to help do a review of the education work at the Getty Museum. And at the end of that, I met the president, and we talked about ways in which they were trying to promote education. I said, so why did you close down the Education Institute? And he said, because we felt after a while that the DBAE, as important as it was, wasn't the only way to do this. We've become very associated with it, but there are other ways of approaching art education, and we thought we should be open to support some other approaches as well. And we've supported this for 15 years, and we're a private institution. We thought we should move on. In any case, he said, we're a cultural organisation, and therefore we are an educational organisation, and we thought it was time to infuse education across the whole system that we have here. So I said, what are you going to do next? He said, well, we don't know yet. We're going to try and work that out. So he asked me out, and I joined a series of think tanks the following summer, and I helped them to think about what they could do in education. And a few months later, they contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested to come and help them do it. And truthfully, Tim, they asked me on the right day. I'd completed a whole cycle of work in the UK. I'd done a lot of work in Northern Ireland as part of the peace process. I'd been running a national commission in the UK at the request of the government to look at promoting education, creativity in education across the school system. And there come moments in your life where you think, I'm ready for the next thing now. Yeah. If they'd asked me the year before, I couldn't have done it. The following year, I would have been into something else. But on the day they asked me, which was the early part of January 2001, my wife and I had been thinking about maybe spending some time in America. Yeah. We liked it here, and we thought it would be interesting, and that maybe we had something to bring to it. Plus, it was England, and it was raining. And the question was, would you like to come and live in California? We said, we left immediately. And I don't think I even asked who was calling. I just said, when do we get the tickets? So we came out, and it was a good arrangement. It was to help them, to be part of their policy-making process to look at the future of their role in education. But I was also involved in lots of other projects, and our arrangement included me carrying on with a lot of those things. And so we were delighted to be, and we've been here ever since. It's been 16 years now. I was at the Getty for about 5 years, but by then we'd moved on to other things. It's similar and it's different to what's happening in Europe. There are some very similar issues that confront education here. One of them is that this period of my being here has coincided, in fact, it started a bit before that, with this growth of the testing culture here through No Child Left Behind, which had its own prehistory. But there had been a so-called reform movement in the UK, or in England, I should say, for a number of years as well. I wrote a report with others in the early 80s called The Arts in Schools. And that was in the context of an attempt to reform education, which was made manifest in some legislation in 1988. And the arts were being marginalised there. It was the beginning of the big testing culture in the UK. Other countries have joined in since. There's a wonderful guy called Pasi Solberg, who written a lot about what's happening in Finland, and he talks about GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. GERM, and it is contagious, as it's turned out. In America, it's been a period of intense testing. Billions of dollars have been spent on the testing culture here. So, it's not just the arts. I'm very keen to say that. I don't want to associate creativity exclusively with the arts. You can be creative in science and technology. Anything that involves human intelligence is a scene of creative possibilities. The arts are not the creative bit of the curriculum. They need not be. They shouldn't be seen that way. But they are also creative, but there are other reasons why the arts matter as well. They're to do with the development of sensibility, of self-understanding, of cultural literacy and cultural knowledge, of having a sense of human community, and of engaging with some of the greatest works that human consciousness has ever produced. There are all kinds of reasons for the arts, intellectual, social, cultural, and they include the fact that these are also areas of creative activity. But science is deeply creative too, and so is engineering. So it was to look at those sorts of areas of synergy that it seemed to me very important. So there are some common themes. If you're on Earth and involved in education, you'll find them cropping up everywhere, in Australia, across Europe, in Asia. I've spoken at events, worked in institutions in Southeast Asia, in Australia as well, and and across Europe. You find yourself at home in a lot of these debates, no matter where you go. Of course, there are local cultural variations as well. I think in America, one of the distinctive things, it's even more the case here, I'd say, than in some other places, certainly in parts of Europe. The politicians here have bought in a very big way to testing, and have spent extraordinary amounts of money on what is a failed experiment.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars. And the effect has not been to improve standards in the areas that have been targeted. It's not been to improve motivation. It's not been to improve the economic performance of the country. It's not satisfied employers or parents, and it's done nothing for the non-graduation rate. But there has been a faith in it, combined with the release of market forces across education, which I think on the whole has been counterproductive. And it's a funny thing, when you come into a different culture, there are all kinds of quirks about British culture, don't get me wrong. And I know what they are. So, I live here, so I feel qualified to say something about it. It's interesting to me how, it's things that people take for granted because they're in their face all the time. They don't even think that's a thing. One of the things that strikes me coming to America is how numbers driven the culture is. Like, for example, if you go to the cities, all the streets are numbered. It's like 42nd Street, 43rd Street. That doesn't happen in European countries. It's called like Pudding Lane, or Edgware Road. We don't talk about West 58th Street.
Right.
But on the whole, in America, because of the way the cities evolved when they did and grew up with the motor car, and they're built on these grid systems, they're all numbered. There are some cross streets which have names, but you know what I'm saying. Schools are all numbered. The districts are numbered, so it's like school number 1, school 32. They're all numbered. The presidents have all got numbers. Like the 44th.
Yes.
We refer to the president as number 44. That doesn't happen anywhere else. We do not refer to it. We don't know what number our prime minister is at the moment. We have no idea. We do know there was George III.
Yeah.
Kings, yes. Queens, yes. Elizabeth II, yes. It's easy to keep track of that, and it's just a way of distinguishing it. But we don't talk about the Queen as 42.
Right.
It's just because there was an Elizabeth before that. Now, it's in the bloodstream to quantify, to number things, and it's neither good nor bad in itself. But you can see how easily it crosses over to ideas of reform. That it's the numbers that matter, like the grades, the numbers. Now, other school systems do have grades and numbers, but I'd say the reliance on standardized testing and the amount of money and faith that's been invested in it is probably more characteristic here than most other places that I know of. I don't mean the pressures are less intense. In Southeast Asia, there are intense pressures on kids.
Right.
But I think politicians kind of just go there. It's a numbers game. And it's everywhere, but it's, I think, particularly intense here. And it's therefore a bit more difficult to get people to think differently about it and get them off it.
Yeah, and so I guess if I can follow up on that a little bit, like if you were able to, see our educational system be reformed and, concentrate less on numbers, on testing, where would you like to see things go? What do you think would be most beneficial for students and for teachers if we were able to, create a good way to reform our system?
Well, I think the reforms are happening. Changes are happening. I published a book recently. It's called Creative Schools.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the English subtitle is Revolutionizing Education from the Ground Up. And the American subtitle, I mean, I didn't choose the different subtitles, the publishers did, but the American one is The Grassroots Revolution That's Transforming Education. The thing is, education is not monolithic, it's not set, it's not unchanged. On the contrary, it's a human system, so it's changing. It's like cities aren't set, they're constantly, wherever there are people thinking, there's change happening.
Mm-hmm.
And there are changes happening in education. Some of them are from within, because teachers and kids and parents and superintendents are restless in all kinds of ways about the impact that this testing culture has had over the past 15 years. I get to talk with people all across the country. I speak to school boards, administrators, superintendents. It's very rare, in my experience, to have people dig in and say, no, trust me, it hasn't worked yet, but it's going to. Just be patient. Yeah. People can see it's not working. Even in Texas. Texas is really where the testing culture took root and from where it spread.
Right.
I was recently with the Texas Association of School Administrators talking about these things at their annual conference, and there's a big shift away from it in parts of Texas. We talk a bit about that in the book. So there are internal pressures for change. There's a lot of unrest, and a lot of educators know it's not even in their heart. They've always felt it. I often say to parents, parents complain about all the testing and the narrowness of the curriculum that's resulted in schools, as if the schools want that. And I keep saying to them, but they don't. They are under as much pressure as you are. This isn't how teachers want to work. They find it absolutely catastrophically suffocating. They don't want to work this way. It's not, by the way, to say that data has no role in education improvement. Of course it does. There are all kinds of ways in which diagnostic data are helpful. It's like going for a medical exam. You want, give me some tests. But you want more than just to be tested. You want people to use that stuff in the interest of improvement. And the problem in the school testing culture is the sort of data that's being collected and the uses to which it's being put. If it were being used genuinely to help teachers understand better ways of teaching, ways they can improve their practice, if it was being used to help kids understand where they need to improve and how they could do that, that's fine. But it's become a sort of steeplechase in the interest of of competition and funding. So there's a restlessness within the profession. I know that. I'm sure everyone listening to this is part of it, and they know it too. Mm-hmm. And that's a big force for change. But there are also disruptive changes happening outside of the K-12 school system. One of them is the explosive growth in digital technologies, which are making new forms of profiling and also access to new tools for teaching available in schools. Kids are on top of this stuff, and teachers are beginning to see, some more than others, how we can use these to greater effect. So that in itself is disruptive. People are going online to learn who might otherwise have gone to college. I know that's part of what Art Ed Now is tapping into, and quite rightly. Another big disruptive force is the value of college degrees is tumbling, with an important percentage of graduates unable to find work in their field, even though they have a degree, and many more of them being employed in areas where the degree is irrelevant. They just happen to have a degree. Yeah. Well, that's a big disruptive influence, because it's the university system that's been the keystone keeping this system in place for a long time. And the growing costs of getting a university degree and the mounting problems of student debt are turning people away. People who might have gone to college think, well, is this really worth it? Mm-hmm. So universities are having to change, colleges are changing, new sorts of colleges begin to spring up. MOOCs are an interesting evolution, but people haven't quite figured out yet how to make them work properly. Some people have. There are one or two that are getting the hang of this now. But that's an evolutionary step as well. And then there are global shifts in population, shifts in the way the economies are working. And the biggest disruption yet hit, as I think, in the job market is going to be artificial intelligence and robotics. That's going to wipe out all kinds of jobs that people have had in the past. But it will also, inevitably, because these things do, create new opportunities that we haven't figured out yet. So it isn't that the world is standing still or that education is standing still. Things are shifting. And I'm just one of a number of people who are drawing attention to these changes and encouraging schools to change with them and to be ahead of the curve, not behind it. Because it's in our best interest, or the children's best interest, that we should do that. And inevitably, when people work on their own in schools and feel isolated, they may feel these changes they're the only people being affected by them, and it's important for them to see that there is a bigger movement here that they can be part of. It's equally important that politicians understand as well that they're holding important changes back in schools by this apparently unshakable belief that the testing system is the best way to get the changes brought about that they think are important, and they're not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if we can dive into the idea of that external change a little bit, and driving what schools are doing, when you talk about the future, what our educational system should be preparing kids for, I guess a two-part question there, like what role do you think creativity is going to play in those sort of future careers, and how do we get our kids ready for that? Like how can we use that creativity or use what we can teach them to prepare them for what's coming?
Well, I should say that firstly that I'm not contrary to all evidence, no doubt, I'm not obsessed with creativity.
Right.
I don't think it's the answer to everything. It's not the only thing I'm interested in. It's what I have latterly been spending some time talking about. It's what I did talk about at TED. But to me, it's part of a much bigger set of ideas. But just to talk about creativity for a moment, I've long argued this, that there are few things that set us apart from the rest of life on Earth. Very few, when you think of it. Mm-hmm. We are mortal creatures. Our lifespans are relatively short. We are perishable. We depend on the planet to be here at all and to survive in any form. I know people who live in the inner cities sometimes think that McDonald's is the main source of human flourishing, but people who live in agriculture areas, no. There's a more intimate relationship with the planet than we get from IHOP. But some things clearly do set us apart. We are sitting here in a hotel making a podcast. This is not an institution that's run by cats and dogs who have allowed us in for the time being while they're doing their own podcast. Human beings are intensely creative creatures. We build civilizations, we create technologies. Our cultural progress is constantly changing and shifting. We always lived in a virtual reality, long before Oculus and Facebook. Human beings live in a world which is framed by our ideas, our languages, our beliefs, our value systems, many of which we have because we grew up with people who have them. And the word we have for that is culture. But we don't just live in a world of sensory experiences. We live in a world of conceptions and theories and ideologies. And that you meet people in particular religious communities, they see the world in a way that is different from other communities. You grow up, you meet with people who live in a particular cultural tradition or community, they see the world differently. I don't mean it totally differently. I mean, if you see a table, they see one too. Mm-hmm. It's not like, they might see some other purpose for it that you haven't thought about. But the thing that impels human beings is our commitment to ideas, whether they're explicit ones or ones that are kind of marinated in our consciousness in some way. We invent, we turn our attention to things, we create technologies, we create systems of government, we create ways of living together. No other creature on Earth does that. Anything approaching the level of sophistication that we do, it's what makes us who we are. And for me, one of the well springs, it's a catch-all phrase to use it, but it's not a single power, it's not like your hearing, but we have a suite of capacities that are captured by the word imagination. It's the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present, to hypothesize, to suppose, to... Now, I was in Paris recently, and at the Rodin Museum. And in the garden, if you ever next time you're there in Paris, go and check it out. It's fantastic. But in the garden is, one of the casts, because he created bronzes, one of the casts of the thinker, iconic sculpture of a guy. It happens to be a guy who's sort of bent over, sitting with his elbow on his knee and his fist under his chin, having a think. Well, it's more than a statement about one guy who is struggling with depression. That's not what that's about.
Right.
What the image is about is the reflective consciousness of human beings, or the way we ponder our circumstances and our possibilities. And creativity is sort of the executive branch of that. It's putting your imagination to work, and it's applying our imaginations and our practical powers to make things, to either seeing new possibilities and to bringing them about, or creating solutions to problems we have already. It's often fired by constraints, by a practical thing we're trying to solve. I was thinking recently, I was talking about this, about the moonshot. When Kennedy said we want to put a man on the moon within 10 years, he galvanized hundreds of thousands of people to work collaboratively to solve that problem across all kinds of disciplines. It had a massive effect on the education system, and it was sponsored by Sputnik going up into the air. It was like a tremor ran through the country. The Russians were getting ahead of us here, so it was a gesture. It was something to aim for. It wasn't that he was thinking, and what we could do is maybe have like a summer home on the moon. It's like, if we can do that, think what else we could do. It was a focus, but it was also a big constraint. And creativity is often spurred by constraints like that. He didn't pick the science community and the arts community who got engaged in that process. They didn't say, look, we can do this. Is there any way we could bring the moon a bit closer? Could we do that? Because we can get halfway. If we could do that in 5 years, if that's okay, Mr. President. The constraint help. And that's what happens. Creativity is generated by our turning our attention to things, saying, how could we do that? And it is in every field. Getting to the moon is one thing, but it would be hard to say that when Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony, he was solving a practical problem of some sort. It wasn't like, we can't fix this till we have the ninth. Because we turn our creative capacities to problems of sensibility, to problems of understanding, kind of existential problems of our being in the world. So creativity, the concept of creativity to me is a portal into a much bigger conversation about what it is to be a human being and what education can do to cultivate the powers that make us human, while not forgetting that we're part of an ecosystem as well. Now, to me, it's essential because it's a way of fulfilling our own human possibilities. But also, we are now overcrowding this planet. We are 7.5 billion people. We're heading to be 10 billion people. More people than have ever lived on the Earth at the same time before. We're exhausting the planet in the way we're behaving. The planet's going to be fine, by the way. People keep saying we should save the planet. I'm not worried about the planet. The planet will be fine. It will shake us off like a rash. Tried humanity, not so good. We're sticking with bacteria, they're fantastic. But we have created for ourselves existential challenges now, because the way we have lived since industrialism, in the way that we've related to the earth, the way we've built our cities, the way we're educating our children, they're based on impersonal, artificial systems, and the planet is reacting to them. And they've been caused by our creativity. And the only way we'll fix them is to get more creative, not less creative, and to rethink some of the principles on which we function as a species. Well, education is how we're supposed to develop those powers. So creativity, say, is one of a suite of ideas to do with what makes us human and how we can create the conditions for our perpetual flourishing in our lives and together on the planet. And that is not anything to do with PISA and its league tables, or Pearson and its testing. There's a bigger mission here for educators to be involved in, and the reason I began in the field of arts education is because I think the arts are about what it is to be human. They're not more important than the sciences, but they are as important. And until we understand they are as important, we're not going to get the education systems our kids need.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you've mentioned a couple times now about how creativity is not exclusive to the arts, and how disciplines can and should be working together. And that reminded me of the chapter in Creative Schools about High Tech High in San Diego, where they're sort of moving away from that bell schedule where it's 50 minutes here, 50 minutes here, 50 minutes here, and they're going for the much more like immersive experience where all of these interdisciplinary connections are being made, subjects are being studied together. Do you think that, that sort of format, that sort of framing of education is a worthwhile way forward? Do you think more schools should be exploring that?
Absolutely. Yes, I do. And High Tech High is a famous example just now. I think it's a really interesting and clearly productive approach. It's not the only way to do it. There's more than one way to write a rock and roll song. There's more than one way to be a band and do hip hop. And the point is to be creative in how we do school. Mm-hmm. I also talk in creative schools about big picture schools who are having great results, not just in terms of tests, but in terms of the engagement of young people in being educated and the opportunities that education makes available to them subsequently. And their particular model is to work closely with businesses in the community and get kids out into the world beyond school while they're at school. There are lots of ways of doing it. There's a democratic school movement in the Middle East that came originally out of the work of a wonderful man called Yaakov Hecht in Hedera in Israel, where the schools are part of what are called education cities, where the whole city is involved in sustaining and developing the school. There are examples of those in other parts of the world, including some here in America. The thing I always want to emphasize is that at the heart of it, a school isn't necessarily what we think of as school, not just the way we have become used to doing schools. A school essentially is a community of learners. That's it, really. It's why you have a school online. It's why the Art Ed Now will be a school while it's happening. A school is a community of learners who come together with the intention to learn with and from each other. And it's important because although learning is a personal process, much of what we do learn is social. We learn it from other people. I didn't invent English, and nor did you. We're speaking it because we grew up with people speaking it. Right. If we all had our own language to speak, this would be a very short podcast, wouldn't it? So, in fact, you'd be looking for another job entirely to invent it. So, knowledge and understanding is a fabric, and we weave it together. And it's why when kids learn to speak, they speak the language of the people they're with. It'd be very odd if some kid was brought up in the Bronx and suddenly spontaneously started speaking Romanian.
Right.
Of course not. It's an aphorism to say, but that's an important thing to remember when we think about a school. A school is a community of learners. So the question then is, well, what makes a great community work? Over the past 150 years or so, schools have taken on a particular form. They've become certain types of institution. They're in imposing buildings. They have separate rooms where separate subjects are taught very often. They have schedules and bells that ring and holidays. Well, these are all inventions that have accreted over time to serve a particular set of purposes. But they don't have to be that way. They can be any way that works. We could have 6 people in here now, and we do actually, but we could have a school right here. So part of this is to encourage school administrators and principals and the parents and the kids to think, are there better ways we could do school in the interest of everybody involved? For example, there are some schools where the parents learn alongside the kids. Absolutely. There are plenty of adults out there who missed out on education who would like to go back to school, but they don't have to go to another school. They could be in the same classroom with the kids and help the kids. Yeah. I wrote about some of them in creative schools. High Tech High is an example of people doing that and saying, well, we could have science over there, we could have technology there, we could have art there, but what if they all got together and worked on the same sort of projects? It's not at the expense of their disciplines. It's not asking artists to give up being artists and become scientists or vice versa. It's seeing what can come when people bring their different expertise to bear on the same sorts of issues. There are lots of that's the exciting part about this. There are lots of other ways of doing school. And part of the adventure here is not just to cultivate kids' creativity, but to encourage creativity in how we think about school.
Yeah, and I'll say though, like as much as teachers love thinking about these things and are inspired by these sorts of ideas, I know a lot of them still kind of feel trapped by, what's going on in their own schools and their own classrooms, and they feel a lot of, I guess, pushback even against creativity or innovation or just trying to do things differently. So I guess what advice would you give those teachers that are feeling frustrated by kind of the pushback, or frustrated or burned out by the system that they're in? Like, do you see a pathway to kind of build teacher resiliency to hold back against what's going on, but also help them to create a path forward and incorporate some of those different ideas into their classroom?
Yes. They're right to be frustrated. I don't minimize that at all. I've worked in institutions and I found them sometimes liberating, sometimes terribly frustrating. That's the way of institutions. They set up boundaries. Some are good, some are bad. They have habits, roles, and they vary in their internal culture. But also schools are working under intense external pressures. So I'm not for a moment being utopian about this and saying, come on guys, just shake it up.
Yeah.
Of course it's difficult, and people are working under intense pressure, and they have a life too on top of all that. Teachers aren't put in a cupboard at the end of the day.
Right.
They go home and they've got all their other stuff to deal with. They may have families, they may be in complex relationships. In fact, if you're in a relationship, you're in a complex one already, so just it's in the way of it, isn't it? But some of them are just horrible. They've got their own lives and aspirations and the things they fall asleep worrying about and the things they wake up thinking about. So no, I mean, it's real life, and some schools are better than others. And I'm always keen to say to people that this is your life too. And if the situation is genuinely, as far as you can tell at the moment, impossible or just so unappetizing you can't deal with it, then do you have to?
Right.
I'm not telling people to walk out. I'm just saying, but think about it. It's the boiling frog thing, isn't it? The situation becomes bad over time, but so slowly you don't realize it's becoming possible. Some situations are actually impossible. I remember an old friend of mine used to tell us, it was a little poetic thing, I can't remember where it came from, but they said it was impossible, but he laughed and he got right to it. He tackled that job that couldn't be done, and he couldn't do it. And there is a certain truth. Sometimes you think, I don't know if I can, I don't know. Or maybe I can't deal with this right now. Anyway, I'm not preaching an article of despair. I'm saying, but teachers live complex and demanding lives. They can be tremendously fulfilling too. But it's your life, and so you have to give some thought to, is this more pain than pleasure?
Right.
And in terms of your own balance of things, just think of that too. It's not all about the kids. It's not all about everybody else. It's also about you. So think about that, about your own internal ecosystem. That said, there's often more room for change than people think there is. And for example, when I was saying this in the creative schools, when the door closes on your classroom or your studio, for the kids in the room, what you do next is the education system. It's not what Betsy DeVos might be cooking up. It's not what's happening in Washington. For the kids who are sitting in front of you or standing in front of you, you are the education system. And what you do next is that. So if you tell them all to sit down and fold their arms, that's a choice you've made. If you say, look, let's get rid of the desk minute, let's get into some groups. If you say, here's a worksheet, start going through it. Or if you say to them, here's a question, I want to get into groups of 4 and see how you can figure this out. And we'll come back together in 20 minutes and let's share some ideas. You have a discretion to do that. And teaching at its best is a creative profession, and it's why most people go into it. And I think it's important for people to believe in their own creative powers, but to cultivate them. It's not easy to come up with fresh ideas. That's why we're making a fuss about it.
Right.
But you have to practice at it. But there is a room, I'm saying, in most classrooms for most teachers to be able to move things around and try things differently. Now, obviously, some classrooms are intensely difficult, and it depends where they are and who's sitting there in the room. And that's the point of wanting to empower teachers and give them the right professional development and support and backup. If you throw teachers into a kind of a cauldron of bad behaviour, it's hard to teach anything at that point. Mm-hmm. And it's deeply exasperating. So it depends on your situation. You need to take stock of your situation. But generally there's room for improvement within what you do. There's also room in any school for things to change, but it depends on the school leadership being put in to make it change. I've been to schools which have been transformed from being dropout factories, as they're sometimes called, into thriving hubs of engagement because a new head teacher came in, a new principal came in and said, let's do this differently. I've written about them in the book, and there are plenty of examples out there. With the right vision, leadership and support, things can begin to shift. And so I always want to say to principals too that you're the system. What can you do to change this? And if enough people change, the system starts to change. So it's not fixed. That's really the point. But it does depend a lot on people feeling that they themselves are being fulfilled in the process. And I know people who decide that they just need to get on a program for a bit. They need to, with art teaching, you need to talk to other art teachers, share ideas. There's a big movement in America just now. It's just become a global thing, and I think it's fantastic. It's called EdCamp. And I just did a short introduction to one that was happening in Ukraine. I mean, interesting, Creative Schools has been, I think it's now in 23 languages, and it's just been published in Ukraine. Yeah. And they've been having meetings all across Ukraine about it. This is in a country that's teetering on the edge of a terrible conflict, and parts of it are already engulfed in it. But they can see that these issues are important. I mean, I didn't go to Ukraine and say, let me sort this out for you. They contacted me and said, we think this book is important here, and it's an important conversation for our teachers. But they just had their second annual EdCamp. And EdCamp is basically, it's a gathering of teachers with no keynote speeches. I mean, I did a short welcome to EdCamp thing, but it's an organic place where people just come together to learn from each other. I think it's what you're doing through Art Ed now. You're putting teachers in touch with each other to share ideas and build strength from each other's resources and a sense of corporate engagement, collective engagement. That really matters, because if you're on your own labouring quietly, or maybe not even quietly, but you feel you're neither loved by the administration and you're the only voice out in the wilderness, it's very hard to keep yourself going on that basis. But I think teachers need to be empowered. They need to know that there are other people engaged in this too, and to make common cause and to connect with them and to learn from them. And that's been one of the problems with the testing culture. It's encouraged a dynamic of competition. And above all, education is a collaborative process. So I think the more teachers can connect with each other and maybe just make some small changes, try something different out, that you've not done before, just break the pattern a little bit and see if it helps.
Yeah, I think that's some excellent advice. And I just have one last question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now, what you have coming in the future? Because I know that you are working on a new book about education for parents. So can you talk a little bit about what's coming from that and what else you might be working on?
Yeah. The book I'm writing now is a book for parents. It's not about how to be a good parent. I wouldn't have the nerve, frankly. I'm not a tiger mum. I'm not that self-confident that I know how to be a good parent. I've got opinions about it, but no, I'm going to leave that to tiger mums and Dr. Spock. What the book is about is education for parents, because parents are, of course, deeply invested in education. They often don't know more about education than the education they had, what they read about, or the school their kids go to. And I'm constantly asked by parents as I travel around. I get asked about the big questions, and more often than not, what about our Michael, or our Susan, or Brittany, and I've got this problem, and can I come and talk to you about it? And with the best will in the world, you can't. It's not my. I don't have that kind of consultancy or organisation to help people like that. But I know because I've been a parent and I am still, and I hang out a lot with parents, and a lot of people I speak to, in whatever capacity, teachers are parents too, and well, parents, they're everywhere, and I think it's important that they get some information, advice where I think it's possible to give it, on the sort of education their kids need these days, because often, against their will, parents can become part of the problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Because they, for example, to take the particular theme of our conversation, often parents don't see why their kids should do art at school. Yeah. They think it's a waste of time. Nice, but they don't all think that, but some of them do think that. Oh. They can't see why kids should do music necessarily at school. Isn't it important they just get their results, get the GPA sorted out? And they can be pushing hard for their kids to go to college and do a law degree when their kid might be configured to do something else entirely and might be better off doing something else entirely. So part of the purpose of the book is to set out a bit what the landscape looks like, what they have every right to expect from education, and what type of education might be best for their own child. The book is provisionally called You, Your Child and School. Mm-hmm. And it's offering advice and a kind of roadmap for how they could get the best education for their child in their circumstances. Also, the situation's complicated now because of the way charters and private corporations are getting involved in education. It used to be that every parent sent their kids to local public school. Mm-hmm. They still do mostly. It's still well over 90% of kids go to public schools, but for a growing number, there are alternative schools, online schools, virtual schools, there are charter schools, magnet schools, and for the average parent, it's just a maze, so we're trying to just give them a guide to that stuff as well. But along the way, to get them to think about education a little differently. So it's been an interesting book for me to write, because it means you've got to step outside your own patois and not take for granted things that for people who work in education may seem to be obvious. Right. So I'm doing that. That's due to come out next spring. I'm doing a third edition of Out of Our Minds, because the publisher asked me to do that. So it's always a mistake to open up a book you wrote 10 years ago, because you immediately want to rewrite the entire thing. Not because I've changed my mind about anything in it particularly, but other things have happened since. The last edition of Out of Our Minds came out, I think, in 2011. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of things have happened since then. So I'm just updating it, clarifying it here and there. So that's going to come out in the fall. But the other thing we're working on at the moment is taking the ideas and principles and practices that are in the Element books, The Element and Finding Your Element, and creating some digital platforms and materials out of those, because people have asked me about that. And some people like to sit and read books and some people don't. And some people learn better, more actively, and there are ways in which those ideas can be made more accessible, I think, in digital form. So I'm working actually with I have a team that work on that, a company called Nevergrey. I'm hoping to get that stuff out early next year as well.
All right, that sounds like a lot of really, really good stuff that we can look forward to.
I hope so.
So, all right, well, thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to sit down and chat.
Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.